Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two stories of people who were caught in a blizzard while they were deep in the remote Appalachian Mountains. Miles from help, with almost no way to call for assistance. Being trapped out there, in that kind of cold, with the wind wiping out any sense of direction. It's the kind of situation where even a small mistake can turn deadly. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I still think about that trip more often than I wish I did, even though it's been years. And even though I've done everything I can to push the memory down into the part of my mind where I keep things that feel too big to deal with. It was supposed to be a harmless getaway, one of those early winter escapes where a group of friends rents a family cabin in the Appalachians before the ski season fully kicks in. Just to unwind, disconnect from the world for a few days, and make dumb memories that only matter to us. Bruno's family had owned that place for generations. A small, old cabin tucked in the woods above a tiny mountain town in West Virginia, surrounded by ridgelines that felt both peaceful and suffocating depending on how far you wandered. They went there every year, sometimes multiple times, and he always spoke about it like it was this sacred space where nothing bad ever happened. A place where he'd grown up skiing badly and drinking cheap beer with cousins who never cared if he fell on his face. We arrived at the cabin late on a Thursday evening, tired but excited. And the plan for the next day was simple. Wake up early, have a quick breakfast, and spend the day skiing down the smaller slopes behind the ridge that overlooked the property. We were stupidly overconfident, too used to doing things without checking weather updates. Too busy laughing and throwing our gear around to notice the notifications our phones had been sending since the night before. Only later did I realize how irresponsible we had been, how none of us had bothered to look at the weather advisory clearly stating that everyone in that region should stay home because of a heavy snowstorm expected to hit by late afternoon. We told ourselves that warnings were always exaggerated, that it wouldn't be that bad, and that, at worst, we'd head back early, if the wind got annoying. By the time we had our boots on and took our first clumsy runs down the slope, the morning felt harmless. The sky was bright in that winter way, where everything looks sharper and colder than it is. And I remember thinking how lucky we were that we had the whole day to act like idiots without anyone else around to witness it. Around noon, though, something shifted. And not just in the weather. I felt a sharp pain shoot through my ankle after a bad landing. And even though I tried to brush it off, I knew immediately that I had messed something up. Walking felt wrong. Like every step made my bones grind together just slightly out of place. I told the others I'd head back to the cabin, and since we were still close enough to the ridge that I could see the cabin roof through patches of trees, it seemed like an easy, boring walk downhill that wouldn't take more than 40 minutes if I didn't push it. The plan was simple. I'd get back, rest my foot, warm up, maybe make tea, and wait for them to return within an hour or two at most. Nothing about that sounded threatening. Nothing about it felt like the beginning of something I'd still be thinking about decades later. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me out of habit more than caution, and I remember how the silence inside felt heavier than usual. Like the storm had already started pressing against the walls, long before the first flurries appeared. I spent the next hour limping around the place, trying to familiarize myself with where everything was, since I'd never stayed there before. Opening drawers and cabinets and closets, just to distract myself from how strangely uneasy I felt being up there alone. It wasn't a fear of the woods or the isolation, not exactly. It was more the awareness that I didn't have the experience the others did, that I wasn't used to being in places where the nearest help was miles away and the phone signal came and went like a breathing thing. Bruno had the satellite phone in his pack, so if something happened, I was stuck with the regular cell that only worked when it felt like being generous. Snow began falling harder outside, sticking to the window frames and piling against the porch railing, but I kept assuming they'd be back soon. Then an hour passed, then another. I watched the light fade behind the ridge, watched the forest grow darker and heavier, and the more I stared out the window, the more I felt a cold I knew wasn't coming from the broken weather strip under the kitchen door. I tried calling them, texting, refreshing the signal, holding the phone in the corner of the cabin that Bruno had said sometimes caught a bar or two, but nothing went through. The wind was starting to howl, not violently yet, but enough that I kept glancing at the tree line and imagining shapes moving between the branches. By the time night hit for real, I was almost sick with worry. My thoughts kept cycling through the same scenarios, one of them slipping, another getting lost, all of them stuck in the storm with temperatures dropping fast. I tried reasoning with myself, telling the logical part of my brain that they were experienced enough to handle this. But the truth was that the storm was getting bad fast, much faster than we had expected, and the silence in that cabin felt like a weight pressing into my lungs. Around 8 p.m., when I'd already convinced myself something horrible had happened, my phone buzzed, startling me hard enough that I dropped it on the couch. It was a message written at the edge of whatever signal he must have caught. They had gotten caught in the storm. Visibility had disappeared in minutes, and they'd been forced to descend the mountain toward the town rather than try to make it back to the cabin. They were safe, but they'd have to stay there overnight. He included a rushed explanation of the cabin basics, where the firewood was kept, which switch controlled the backup generator, where the emergency blankets were, though I had already found most of it while nervously pacing earlier. Knowing they were safe should have calmed me, but instead, it made me realize that I truly was spending the night alone in that cabin. With no stable connection to the outside world, and no real experience surviving in conditions like that. I kept telling myself it was fine, that it would be a story to laugh about someday, that nothing bad actually happens in places where families spend decades skiing and drinking hot chocolate on weekends. Still, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked, lowered the shutters, and double-checked every latch. Then, I started a fire, sat close enough to feel the heat, and tried not to think about how big the shadows in the corners looked when the flames flickered. But I miscalculated the firewood. I told myself the pile of logs beside the hearth would last longer, that I'd grabbed enough earlier while inspecting the cabin, but less than an hour later the fire was shrinking, cracking softly as the last logs burned down. I knew how quickly the temperature could drop once the fire went out, and with the storm building into something loud and relentless, the idea of letting the cabin get cold felt like a mistake I couldn't afford. So I convinced myself I had no real choice but to head out to the woodshed for more. The woodshed wasn't far, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the cabin. Still, the moment I opened the door, the wind felt like a shove to the chest, sharp and thick with snow. I held my flashlight low to avoid blinding myself with the reflection, kept my hood tight around my ears, and moved as fast as I could without slipping. The shed was barely more than a small, crooked outbuilding, with wooden walls that looked patched and soft from decades of storms. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and breathed out the first semi-calm breath I'd taken since the message. I filled my backpack with as many logs as it could handle, counting the seconds in my head and telling myself I'd be inside by the time I reached 50. But when I swung the shed door open to go back to the cabin, my stomach dropped so fast it made me nauseous. The snow outside wasn't smooth anymore. There were footprints, deep, fresh ones, and I knew instantly they weren't mine. For a moment I stood frozen, my breath fogging so hard it felt like I was hyperventilating, and then my body moved on its own. I stepped back into the shed and shoved the door closed, locking it with a rusted latch that looked like an inconvenience more than actual protection. My heart was pounding so violently I could feel it in my fingertips. The footprints were too big, too heavy, spaced like someone walking slowly, deliberately. And there was no reason for anyone to be near that cabin. No neighbors, no hikers, no random passerby. If someone approached in a storm like that without calling out for help, they weren't there by accident. I lowered myself to the small, cracked window and peeked through the glass. At first, I didn't see anything through the white blur of the storm. But then a shape emerged near the back of the cabin. A man dressed head to toe in black winter gear, with some kind of headlamp creating a pale circle of light around his face. He was testing the rear window frame, as if checking for weaknesses. Moving slowly and methodically, never once looking up. I had no idea whether he knew I was in the shed, but the thought that he might have seen me walk out earlier made my skin crawl. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could, holding the frozen air in my lungs until it hurt. I knew those shed walls wouldn't protect me if he decided to come in. Anyone determined could push through rotten wood with a few good hits. I kept thinking about what he was doing, why he was testing the windows instead of knocking, why he didn't call out or shout or try to speak. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that whoever he was, he didn't want help and he didn't want shelter. He wanted inside. I waited until he disappeared from my line of sight before trying to think logically, which was almost impossible with how hard my hands were shaking. If I was going to make it back inside the cabin, I needed to leave the shed without him seeing me. But when I looked again, hoping he had moved deeper into the storm, I saw him appear suddenly near the front of the cabin instead. Either he was impossibly fast, or there were two of them. I couldn't tell through the darkness and the wind, and the uncertainty was worse than the danger itself. My mind kept replaying every horror scenario I had ever heard about remote cabins, strangers, and storms that erased all sound. He was testing the front door now, pulling at the handle, pushing his shoulder against the frame. Even through the wind, I could hear the faint thud of his weight hitting the wood, and I felt my pulse spike so high I thought I might pass out. I ducked fast to avoid being seen through the window, crouching low enough that the cold from the shed floor seeped straight into my bones. I had no plan, nothing besides the desperate desire to stay alive, and the fear that every second I stayed there made it more likely he'd check the shed next. When I finally dared to look again, I didn't see him, but his headlamp glow appeared near the shed door a few seconds later. I watched the thin crack between the boards brighten as he came close. And then I saw his shadow crossing back and forth, like he was listening, or deciding whether to try the door. He touched the handle and pushed, and the old wood creaked under the pressure. It wouldn't take him long. Maybe seconds. I searched the shed frantically for anything resembling a hiding place. But there was nothing besides stacks of wood, tools on walls, and an old tarp that wouldn't hide a person. I kept imagining what he'd do if he opened the door and saw me standing there. And that was when I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. A second door, half covered by a loose plank of wood leaning against it. A back exit I hadn't known existed. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the first key I tried, then the second, and I could feel tears of frustration and fear burning behind my eyes. The third key turned. The relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. I opened the door as quietly as possible, stepped out into the storm, and forced myself not to look back. I heard the shed door crack as he finally forced it open, just as I started running. The snow swallowed every sound I made, which was the only reason he didn't catch me in the first 10 seconds. I sprinted through the darkness, the key to the cabin clenched so hard in my fist that it cut into my palm. And when I reached the porch, I risked a look back. He saw me. I watched him turn, hesitate for half a second, then break into a run straight toward me, the headlamp jerking violently with each step. I didn't think. I opened the cabin door, threw myself inside, locked it, and dragged anything heavy I could grab in front of it. A dresser, a bench, part of the coat rack, pushing furniture with the kind of strength that only panic creates. I could hear him hitting the door, each impact rattling the frame. I knew none of it would hold forever. My hands found the handgun Bruno kept hidden above the fireplace, and without allowing myself to hesitate, I fired a single round into the cabin ceiling. The sound exploded through the room, sharp enough to make my ears ring and my skin vibrate. Silence followed. His hits stopped immediately. The wind raged outside, but nothing else moved. No footsteps, no breathing, no headlamp glow. The only sound was the storm shaking the shutters. I didn't dare open the windows or move the barricade. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, feeding the fire whenever the flames dipped, keeping the gun across my lap, trying to control my breathing and listening for anything that wasn't the storm. But the wind swallowed everything and made the world outside feel impossibly far, like I was staring into a void with no way to know if something was staring back. I only let myself breathe again when, hours later, sometime around 2 in the afternoon the next day, I heard familiar voices calling from outside. My friends. I practically collapsed when I heard them. The police came soon after, hiking their way up with equipment and disbelief written across their faces. They investigated everything, the footprints, the broken shed door, the marks on the cabin entry, but the storm had covered whatever tracks might have told the full story. Bruno kept repeating that nothing like this had ever happened in all the years his family had owned the place, that they'd never even seen strangers near the property. We left that same day without looking back. I don't know if the man was alone, or why he was there, or how long he'd been watching the cabin before I noticed the footprints. I don't know what would have happened if I'd been slower, if the back door hadn't existed, or if the gunshot hadn't scared him off. All I know is that the memory still sits in my chest like a cold stone, and I haven't gone back to the Appalachians since. What I'm about to tell you happened more than 15 years ago, but it's something I still think about every single year, especially in December, when I end up making the same drive where it all happened. I had been on the road for nearly 9 hours, driving from North Carolina up to West Virginia to spend Christmas with my family. It was a trip I made almost every year, usually without incident. But that afternoon the weather reports had started flashing warnings about a sudden winter storm pushing across the mountains. I saw the alert while I was already halfway through the state, and instead of doing the smart thing, pulling over somewhere safe and waiting it out, I convinced myself I could beat it. I kept thinking about how close I was. Less than 2 hours from home. I told myself it would be stupid to stop now, stupid to pay for a motel when my own bed was waiting for me. That decision, which felt small and harmless at the time, turned into one of the biggest mistakes of my life. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the darker it became. The sun dropped faster than I expected, swallowed by clouds that looked like they were tearing across the sky. It wasn't even snowing heavily yet, but the wind was brutal, violent enough that I could feel it pushing against the side of my car, shoving me a few inches across the lane whenever I passed through exposed stretches of highway. Every time the road curved around an open ridge, it felt like I could lose control entirely. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles stiff, stomach clenched. I kept telling myself to turn around, go back the 40 minutes to the last little town I'd passed. But I knew 40 minutes in normal weather meant more than an hour now. And every mile I drove deeper into those mountains made going backward more impossible. But driving forward didn't feel much more possible either. I had put myself in a corridor with no exits. It wasn't panic yet, not at first. But every old story I'd heard growing up about people freezing to death in their cars started pulling at the edges of my mind. It's not an uncommon fear if you grow up in a place like that. You hear things. You learn what can happen to people who make stupid decisions on winter nights. I was one of those people now. By the time the sky went fully black, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, and I had slowed to a crawl. I'd long since given up trying to track the road by any kind of visibility. I was following the vague glow of my headlights against the edges of the guardrails, and praying I didn't drift too far. Eventually, I had no choice but to pull over completely. I checked my phone again, still no service. I cursed myself repeatedly, genuinely angry at how arrogant I'd been. I'd put off buying a satellite phone for years, even though I drove through remote areas all the time. I'd convinced myself it wasn't necessary. I'd convinced myself I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. I sat there in the dark, heartbeat thudding in my ears, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. The wind rocked the car. Snow piled slowly around the tires. My mind kept circling the same thought. If this car dies, I die with it. I was still staring into that pitch-black road when faint lights appeared far behind me. Headlights cutting through the storm. I've never felt relief hit that hard. It was like every nerve in my body jumped awake at once. But right behind that relief came a sliver of doubt. Out here, people are careful, suspicious. Most drivers don't stop for strangers in storms, not because they're cruel, but because they've learned to be cautious. And if this car passed me by, I didn't know what I'd do. Still, I wasn't letting the chance slip by. I forced my stiff legs to move, opened the door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold slapped me instantly, but I waved my arms anyway, hoping, begging that the driver would notice. To my shock, the vehicle slowed immediately. It was a big truck, clearly made for winter roads like these, and the driver lowered the window as he pulled up beside me. Something felt wrong with him the moment I saw his face. Not anything specific, nothing I could point to. Just that instinctive twist in the gut that tells you a person isn't quite right. A kind of wrongness that you can't logically justify but also can't ignore. But logic didn't matter. My options were to get in or freeze to death. So I climbed inside. He started talking right away. Not the quiet, cautious type of man you expect to meet on a mountain road at night. If anything, he was too talkative, too cheerful. The kind of person who forces friendliness into every sentence, filling the air with an energy that feels manufactured, like he was trying to preemptively convince me that everything was fine before I'd even had time to think otherwise. I answered him politely, keeping my tone neutral, but something about the conversation unsettled me. His questions weren't strange on the surface. Where I was coming from, where I was headed, who I was spending the holidays with. But the way he circled around them felt intentional, like he wanted to confirm whether or not someone was expecting me soon, whether or not someone would come looking if I didn't show up. The question that tipped me from uneasy to alarmed came when he asked if the people waiting for me knew exactly where I was. Not just that I was nearby, whether they knew I was here, right now, on this road, in this storm, in this truck, with him. My pulse kicked up hard. He must have seen something change in my eyes, because his expression shifted just slightly. I told him they did, that I had been sharing my location the whole drive, that my dad and brother were already on the road toward me. None of it was true. Nobody knew anything. He didn't like my answer. He kept his expression neutral, but I felt the temperature in the cab drop. Not physically, but in that subtle, unmistakable way someone reacts when a plan they were forming suddenly hits a snag. I told myself I might be overreacting, that the storm and darkness were making me paranoid. But that lie collapsed the minute he made a turn I knew was wrong. He should have gone left. The nearest town was left. I knew those roads intimately. I'd grown up here. To the right, there were only scattered cabins, hunting land, and long stretches of nothing. I had once gotten lost on that same road as a teenager, and had never forgotten it. I asked why we'd turned, and he gave a smooth explanation about an alternate route, a safer one during storms. The kind of answer that would have convinced me if I didn't know better. I pretended to buy it. I even thanked him. I watched his shoulders loosen, just barely. My lie was working. But now I had no plan, and I needed one. Fast. Jumping out of the moving truck wasn't an option. Running into the woods would kill me faster than he could. The only remotely possible strategy was to catch him off guard and use something, anything, in that truck against him. I figured a man like him, driving through the mountains at night, probably had tools, maybe snow gear, maybe even weapons. The back of that truck was my only hope. I just needed an excuse to make him stop. The first thing that came to mind was claiming I needed to piss. Desperately. He hesitated, suggested I wait, said we were close. I told him I couldn't, that I had a medical issue. Eventually, he pulled over. The moment the truck slowed, I bolted toward the back. I prayed the storage compartment was unlocked. It was. In the second it took me to lift the door, I heard him shout and start coming after me. But I'd been faster. My hand closed around the first thing large enough to defend myself. A shotgun. He reached me just as I turned. I brought the butt of the gun up and slammed it into the side of his head, harder than I meant to. My heart was hammering. For a moment I just stood there, staring at him splayed unconscious in the snow, trying to piece together what the hell to do next. The contents of the truck didn't make me feel better. Fuel cans, rope, duct tape, random junk shoved into bags with no clear purpose. Practical items for the mountains? Sure. But also the kind of things you'd expect to see in a true crime documentary about a killer's kit. A sliver of doubt tried to wedge itself into my mind. Maybe he really had just been a weird but harmless local. But no. Him turning down that road had told me everything I needed to know. I found rope and tied him to the back seat of his own truck. I wasn't an expert, but I'd been a Boy Scout long enough to know how to make a knot that wouldn't come loose. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus, to get into the driver's seat, to start the truck, to point it back toward home. The drive felt endless. Every bump made me think he might wake up. Every shadow made me think he'd get free. Every silence made me fear I'd made a massive mistake and was about to be the one arrested. I called my brother when I got close enough to pick up a signal, voice shaking as I told him I needed help. He didn't hesitate. He was already outside when I pulled into my parents' driveway. He took one look at the man tied in the back and recognized him instantly. He said the guy was a carpenter from the area and that a tourist had accused him of attempted kidnapping a couple years back. Nothing had come of it officially, but the story had spread enough that most locals kept their distance from him. Some believed the tourist, some didn't. But everyone agreed the man gave off a bad feeling. My brother said we'd drive him somewhere secluded and leave him there with a warning. One written clearly enough that he wouldn't misunderstand. A threat I hated making. But at that point I understood too well how close I'd come to disappearing in those mountains. For days afterward I expected a knock on the door, or the police showing up, or the man himself coming back for revenge. None of that happened. 15 years have passed now. I still won't drive mountain roads in bad weather. And I never heard another thing about him. But every year around Christmas, when I'm driving home again, I think about that night. Those dark roads, that storm, that man. And I remind myself how easily everything could have ended differently.